small short to appreciate you, but just to make it in 3-4 lines. Anil sir is a retired Indian Administrative Service officer with a span of 38 years. He is 1981 batch and UP cadre and has held various respectable and prominent posts like Whole Secretary in year 2014 and 16 and HRD Secretary in year 2016 and 18 and also Project Monitoring Group Head. Before joining Indian Administrative Services, Sir was also in Indian Police Service for a span of 1 year and was also a recipient of Director's Gold Medal for Best Officer Training during his training days. He has also authored 2 books. The first one is Not Just a Civil Servant in Feb 2019 and the second one is The Ethical Dilemma of a Civil Servant in July 2020. So, sir, we'll start off with the question answer round now.
Please go ahead. Good evening.
Good evening, sir. So, sir, in your book, The Civil Servant, in the first chapter, you expressed that your father desired you to become a civil servant more rather than you. And then in the last chapter, you expressed that in your rebirth, you desire again to become a civil servant again. So, sir, please share your journey along with what made you so attached to this profession.
More than the attachment part, I enjoyed every moment of my existence as a civil servant of 38 years that I put in. And since I enjoyed those moments, I would like to relive those moments if I can in the next birth. So that was the reason. As I have explained in the last chapter, whereas my coming to the service was determined by my father, but my tenure in the service made me believe that there isn't any service anywhere in the world which is better than this in terms of influencing the lives of poor people. You can do a lot of good to them.
Definitely,
and you can derive enormous amount of satisfaction out of the good that you can do to them. And if you read the 2 books that I've written, I've used this term kick. It is the immense sense of satisfaction that you derive out of people who are helpless, who do not have support, who look up to you for help. And if you're able to help them, and a government servant or a civil servant, it provides you an opportunity to help those who can't help themselves. So that's the brilliance of the service, and that is why I would like to be in the service all over again.
All right, sir. So now moving on to the next. You stated that honesty, though, is a very essential key requirement for a civil servant, but even yielding results on the ground is also very essential too. For instance, sir, in your point of view, a corrupt man who's working is still a good civil servant rather than an honest man who's not working. So, sir, what are your views on how a person should evolve himself or herself to become a remarkable civil servant?
No, I don't think I have said that I'm okay with a corrupt civil servant. I have not said that. I'm certainly not okay with a corrupt civil servant. But I'm also not okay with the civil servant who's just honest and doesn't perform. Honesty is a given. In fact, it is an a priori requirement. It is a necessary condition, but not sufficient condition for an officer to be efficient. He has to perform. He's paid to perform. By being honest, he cannot claim a right not to perform. And I see some officers do that. They are honest, full stop. No, I believe that apart from honesty, what is equally important is his ability to perform on the ground, because the common man expects results from him, not mere honesty. Exactly. So let it not be construed that I'm okay with dishonest people. No, I'm not. But I'm certainly not equally okay with just honest people who don't do anything just to keep their honesty and keep themselves above board. There are a large number of officers who've been honest and efficient. That's what I'm looking at. An officer should be not only honest. Honesty alone is not sufficient. He has to be efficient as well. He has to perform on the ground. That's what I mean.
All right, sir. So now we have the third one. That is, you had served with the Chief Minister and the Governor of Uttar Pradesh. And I recently read your article that is specifying the art of saying no to Chief Minister and still surviving. So, sir, like, is it so easy for a civil servant to say no to the CM and easily work up?
It is not very easy. Nothing is easy, by the way, in life, more so in civil service. It is tough. But once you start understanding the nuances of it, once you start understanding that your yes and no is coming out of conviction, not merely to say no. There is a reason behind when you say no. You may still be overruled. There are a number of occasions where I was overruled. But there were a number of other occasions where I said no and the chief minister or the politician agreed with me. There were third situation where they didn't agree with me and I got transferred out. So be it. That's how life is. Sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose some. You don't have to brood over it. I did what I thought was correct and I was prepared to face the consequences. For example, in Hardoi, if you read my second book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, when I was in Hardoi, I refused to withdraw a file which related to a National Security Act case against an MLA, and I faced the consequences. I was transferred out. In another instance, when I was district magistrate at Lakhimpur Kheri, I said no to the chief minister, yet he rewarded me 2 months down the line. So as we are in a country where we should believe, though some of us don't believe, you do your job and results are in any case not in your hand. So let the results come and be prepared for those consequences. So I was prepared for those consequences. I was fine with the consequences so long as my conscience was clear that I did what I thought was correct. That was it. Initially, in the initial phase of my career, yes, there were dilemmas. I was not sure what should I do, whether I should do this or do that. But as I went along in the career, later on in my career, I was absolutely clear in my mind. There was absolutely no dilemma in my mind. Dilemmas did exist objectively, but in my mind they didn't, because I was clear what I had to do and I was prepared to face the consequences.
So like you kept on working and then you were believing in karma also. So that is the main
The issue is very simple. So long as you are prepared for the consequences and you're not overly bothered about the consequences, life becomes easier. Then you are totally focused on your karma, on what you're doing.
Yes.
You start enjoying those moments. You start taking satisfaction out of what you are doing rather than the consequence of it.
All right, sir. Sir, please share your views on the role of technology in governance. Like when you were the project monitoring group head, so all the things were easily made accessed online. How did you manage like all of that? And what are your views specifically on
I discovered
technology?
very early in my career, that technology can be a game changer. And this was, I think, in the year 1990, when I put in just 9 years of service. And I was posted as district magistrate. And there is a chapter in my book, copy that. And that explains how my first initial brush with technology. And this technology was not computer. This technology was a photocopying machine. You know, the amount of corruption there was in the revenue record room because of the delays in delivering copies of the revenue records was phenomenal. And one single technological intervention transformed that. I brought a photocopying machine. In those days, photocopying machines were not the usual thing, at least in the district, they weren't. So in that, all the money, the speed money, that is the urgency in getting the papers, the money that had to be paid, was done away with a single technology intervention. And thereafter in my career, I continued to use technology. I did that when I was Export Commissioner, Government of India. I did that when I was in APIDA, Chairman APIDA. I did that when I was Chairman of the Project Monitoring Group, where we cleared more than 5 lakh crores worth of project at a time when officers were shying from taking decisions because of the various scams. And it happened because we had no file or paper in my office. Everything was digital. Everything was transparent. In fact, when you used to have these meetings, the minutes were dictated directly onto the portal. They were not kept elsewhere. So it was totally transparent. Now, mind you, it was not that I didn't commit mistakes. Mistakes are very logical occurrence if you want to do things. The question is, there was no malafide behind it. So when I declared it into the open, when the mistakes came into the open, I admitted them and corrected them. Same was the case in coal. Coal got sorted out because of technology. Because we again dispensed with all the files and papers in the office. The entire auctioning process was a transparent one. And again, we did commit mistakes. It's not we didn't. But we discovered them, because not only we discovered them, others told us. So once you are transparent and you are using technology, there will be no adverse motive attributed against you. That's important, because as I keep saying, mistakes are a natural occurrence when you do anything. But if you push it under the carpet, it comes out much worse later on. It is better to admit it when you do commit a mistake. So in coal, what we did was we digitized all the systems. We dispensed with files and papers. I distinctly remember, and this is not there in my book, I think I should have written a chapter. I remember one day a CBI officer came to my room and he showed me a paper on which confidential was written. And he said, "Sir, how did we raided the office, the residence of this officer, and we found this." So I told him, "This is a paper which is available on our portal." So I went to the portal and showed it to me that paper is there. There's no secret. So when there's no secret, then he asked me, "Why is confidential written?" I said, "This is probably by tradition. There are papers in which confidential is embedded. So they have typed it on that. So there's nothing confidential about it." So the point that I'm trying to make here is much of the problem relating to corruption is on account of secrecy, on account of delays. Now, instead of chasing people and then they run off to London and have a great time there and we shout here, I'm a great believer in systems. If you put systems in place, make processes transparent, then the incidence of corruption will come down. But our focus is on Lokpal, on big people, because that hits headlines. If you work on processes and digitize them, and I've written in my article, it won't hit headlines. No one will get a big name. But that's what is required. I mean, everyone talks about, look at what have these institutions done to bring down corruption? Someone has to assess and see. Lokpal was announced in the previous elections. Lokpal came into existence more than a year ago. Has the corruption level come down? Or will it come down through this? My hunch is it won't. It will come down through systems. And systems through use of technology. I demonstrated that in Project Monetary Group. It was demonstrated in the coal ministry. It can be done in every ministry. You know, in that article, if you read it, in recently written article, I've asked, why aren't the ministries digitizing their files and papers? That's the first thing and the easiest thing they should do. Why? Because then you will know which paper and which file is pending at which level for how many hours, minutes, and seconds. So once you start pointing that out, things will improve. Now, someone asked me, in the time when all scams were breaking out, how did you manage to get clearance of 5 lakh crores? Simple. The answer was simple. I said, no matter how inefficient I am, to the public, I appear to be efficient. So if the public knows that this Babu is sitting on this file for so long, he will be called to question. I don't know whether you're aware. One cabinet minister lost her job because she was sitting on files worth 54,000 crores. There's another chapter in my book in that name. A particular tax was named in her name and she had to quit the job. So if you create that system, I am a systems man. By creating systems, again, you will not get so much publicity as you would chasing somebody who ultimately flies off to London. He gets publicity, you get publicity, everyone is happy with it. But if you create systems through use of technology, and mind you, I can tell you, I mentioned these things to the Prime Minister and he was very happy, he wanted it done. But someone has to do it. Prime Minister can't do everything. But if corruption has to be handled in this country, the solution is transparency and technology, period.
So, sir, like you believe in working and keeping the things transparent.
Sorry?
The crux is working and keeping the things transparent.
Yes, transparent. Nothing should be hidden. You know, we have still carried on with the British Raj secrecy. I worked in the cabinet secretariat where a normal letter was also confidential. I used to ask, why don't we look at the other way around? Look at everything that is confidential today and only absolutely necessary national interest items should be confidential. And of course, personal items should be confidential. Beyond it, why should there be anything confidential in the government? We work for the people and people have the right to know what is happening.
Exactly, sir.
Look at the drama that is happening in Hathras. Is the classic example of keeping things under the carpet. And people are visualizing all sorts of things. Had it been a transparent thing, I don't think it would have been that big a crisis. By cremating the body in the night, then not allowing people to go. I agree that the politicians do not be allowed to go there because political tamasha should be avoided. But why prevent the media from going there? Let the world know what the ground reality is. And I tell you, if most of the media goes there, no single one will have a story. Facts will come out. Why are we hiding facts?
Yes, sir, that is. So, sir, you were also the pioneer of the Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, a scheme that was widely acclaimed by the United Nations Development Program and also the International Labour Organization, along with the Barack Obama's administration. So, sir, please share your field of vision, like what gave birth to this scheme along with its successful journey?
This was an amazing experience. I don't think there's a civil servant who's had the experience of visualizing, conceptualizing, articulating, implementing, and evaluating a scheme. I had that fortunate thing, but it didn't happen straight away. I remember when I joined the Labour Ministry, within a month, I realized nothing happens in the Labour Ministry. So I tried to understand why nothing happens in the Labour Ministry. And I came to the following conclusion, that we were all in labor. And by definition, we couldn't deliver. Because if we delivered, we'll be out of labor. And hence we did nothing but we were in pain. And around that time, the Prime Minister announced that there should be a health insurance scheme for the poorest of the poor. As it happens in the government, The announcements are made first and then the details are worked out. So in a meeting, I distinctly remember, which was chaired by Mr. Chidambaram, who was then the finance secretary. It was a group of ministers that was to work out the details. And Labour Ministry had nothing to do with health insurance, actually. It was a health domain. So obviously the finance minister who was chairing the meeting asked the health secretary, why don't you come up with a scheme and then we will implement it? So he said, sir, we are already tied up with National Rural Health Mission and we don't have time. So for some political reason, he perhaps didn't want health ministry to do it. He turned towards the secretary banking and insurance, who later on went on to become a CAG and created so much trouble for the government. And he asked him, why don't you do health insurance? His response, or his ministry's response, was that they were already doing a universal health insurance scheme and it was going nowhere. So then suddenly I heard my name being announced because I was representing my ministry. My minister could not go, secretary could not go, so I was there. So he asked me, you do this scheme. So I was a bit shocked because what has Labour Ministry to do with this? But then it was imposed on us. Of course, rest as they say history. We worked it out. We worked out a scheme. We got a lot of cooperation from international agencies. So beginning with absolutely scratch, nothing on the slate, we developed this scheme, which came to be recognized world over as one of the finest schemes in the world. But it didn't happen easily. There was a lot of effort. When we formulated the scheme, we looked at the consumer, we looked at the beneficiary, and formulated the scheme accordingly. The scheme became so well known world over. You announced some of the agencies that I remember when Obama became the president, one of his advisors rang me up and they wanted to understand what we are doing in health insurance here. I tried to wriggle out, but he insisted that you come. So I went to Washington to Brookings Institute, where I made a presentation before these advisors, as well as some representatives of Gates Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. I hope you've heard of these foundations. They do a lot of service to the poor countries. So after the presentation, when I came out, this gentleman from Gates Foundation walks up to me and asks me, Mr. Swaroop, you are a civil servant, but you seem to be very passionate about this scheme. What is the government giving you beyond the salary that you get under this? So this is a very difficult question to answer. And the question that, of course, now I have the answer. At that point in time, I took my time and I asked him a counter question. I asked him, Bill Gates Foundation gives millions of dollars to poor countries. What do you get out of it? So he said, well, that's a job. But more than that, we derive a lot of satisfaction out of the good that we do to poor people. I said, you answered your own question. Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana, RSBY, is meant for the poorest of the poor, many of whom would have been dead but for this scheme. So the good wishes from the survivor and his family come back to me somehow, anyhow. That's good enough a kick for me to do what I am doing. That's the term kick that I used. And then I narrated an incident to him that in this scheme, I used to go to these small hospitals that were impaneled. And in one of the visits to the hospital, I was talking to a beneficiary patient. I heard a very feeble voice from behind. And I turned around, I saw a very old calling me, Beta idhar aao. So I turned around and went to that lady. She was very, very old, very feeble. So I bent down and asked her, Mata ji, aap theek to hain? She said, Beta, main bahut takleef mein hoon, lekin in hospital walon ne mera bada khayal rakha hai. Then I said, तो आप ठीक हो जाएंगे, आप अपने घर जाएंगी. नहीं बेटा, मेरा तो कोई घर नहीं, मैं भीख मांगती थी और मैं बीमार पड़ गई. मेरा पड़ोसी था, वो भी भीख मांगता था, हम लोग झोपड़ी में रहते थे. उसने तुम्हारा ये कार्ड देखा, दिस वाज स्मार्ट कार्ड बेस्ड स्कीम, वो मुझे अस्पताल में ले आया. ये अस्पताल वाले मेरी सेवा कर रहे हैं और मुझसे पैसे भी नहीं मांगते, मेरे पास है भी नहीं देने को. सो आई सेड, नहीं माता जी, आप बिल्कुल ठीक हो जाएंगे, आप जाएंगे. नहीं नहीं बेटा, अब तो मेरी उम्र उतनी हो गई, मैं ऊपर वाले के पास जाऊं. This carried on for 15 seconds and then she made a very remarkable statement. She said, ऊपर वाले जाके एक बात जरूर कहूंगी, तुम्हारी स्कीम बहुत अच्छी है. Now these are the, I call them as Bharat Ratnas in my book. These are the kicks that you get going. That's what RSBY was all about. I'm so glad that after a lean period of 3 years when the government was struggling, the present government was struggling to come up with the health insurance scheme, they have rode on the RSBY to set up this Ayushman Bharat. I'm so glad it's helping the poorest of the poor.
So that's in fact a very generous task that was being done by you.
Sorry?
So sir, I'm saying that was a very generous task which you had taken up on your shoulders and which has served the society.
Yes, yes, yes.
So sir, moving on the next, what are your thoughts on how does historical, social and cultural context of a nation impact the particular governance of that respective nation?
You know, any political functioning is not in a vacuum, it is in a context. So the social context matters because they work in that context. Similarly, the economic context matters. And the politics of the day, both frames and response to the social context, whether it is a social issue or a political issue. And that is why, if you read me recently, and I have alluded to that in my book also, I've talked about making things happen. Now, in India, it's very difficult for anybody to make things happen, because it's very easy to give an idea. So if there is a problem, like in COVID, you talk to anybody, everyone will tell you what needs to be done. They don't realize that in a democracy, for anything to happen, it has to be politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, and judicially tenable. And I added a seventh dimension after this agitation under farm bills, and that is emotionally relatable. Now, why I say that? Because if any idea is not accepted by a politician, do you think it will happen in a democracy? You may have a great idea, but if it is not acceptable, for example, I'm not saying that it would happen or it should happen. If you do a referendum today on reservation, majority of the people will say that it should be dispensed with. No? But is it politically possible for any government to dispense with the reservation? No. So it won't happen. It may be an idea, but it won't happen. Similarly, if an idea is not socially desirable, it won't happen. So you have, a government coming up, politically acceptable family planning scheme during emergency. It led to the fall of the government because what the government was trying to do was not socially desirable. I'm taking an extreme example, but to illustrate my point, that's what I'm trying to say. Similarly, if you don't have the appropriate technology, your idea will not work. So today, some people in COVID time say that why don't you deliver school lectures through internet? But internet is not available throughout the country, so it won't work. So until it's technologically feasible, it won't work. Then if it is not financially viable. Financial viability means that earlier, I don't know, you are very young, but you would not recall, or perhaps you will. Earlier, railway ministers used to announce a lot of railway lines, which never happened because there was no money to back it. हमारी तरफ यूपी में कहते हैं जेब में नहीं पत्ता चल दिया कलकत्ता. So until you have the money to back the schemes, they won't work on the ground. So money is important. Similarly, it has to be administratively doable, meaning thereby you have to have the staff, you have to have the management of that staff. So again, taking example from education, if you don't have teachers, you may have money, but who is going to teach? You have to have teachers. You have to manage teachers well. So I can go on and on. I mean, I can write a book on this aspect, but that's what it is. Finally, judicially tenable. Now, ultimately, if the court grants a stay order, and I have a couple of chapters in my book where I say it was totally frustrating to see that the court granted stay order and it couldn't be done. So what do you do? And the last dimension of emotionally relatable is important in the context of the farm bill, because the farm bill, to my understanding, is very beneficial to the farmer, but it is socially desirable. But the government has not been able to make it emotionally relatable in the sense that the beneficiary doesn't understand or accept it. Should have been done, probably will now be done. So these 7 dimensions are required. Now, the mentioning of these 7 dimensions does not mean that things don't happen. The key is only such things happen which take care of. So, for example, if Swachhata Abhiyan succeeded, it took care of all these 7 dimensions. Another example is the unprecedented increase in coal production between 2014 and 16 happened despite these constraints. The Ayushman Bharat is succeeding despite these constraints. So it's not that these constraints should inhibit you from doing what you're doing, but you have to keep them at the back of your mind and wade through them, not ignore them or avoid them.
All right, sir. So, sir, how fundamentally crucial is public-private partnership? I recently read an article where you had made a visit to a rural school in Maharashtra, and where the teacher was putting efforts to teach the children through the tablet, and that idea was very well appreciated by you, which resulted in many private and public schools in Maharashtra to opt out for digital school learning.
To me, in the social sector, public-private partnership is the key. And the problem is that a large number of us in the government feel that all these NGO people are good for nothing. And a large number of private people feel that everyone in the government is corrupt. Both are equally wrong. So I discovered that during my tenure as education secretary. I remember when I became coal secretary, I didn't know much about coal sector. So I rang up a friend of mine to ask him, "Yaar, ye coal sector kaisa hai?" So instead of answering my question, he asked me a question. Gangs of Wasseypur dekhi hai kya? So that was good enough for me to understand what the coal sector was. But when I became education secretary, I initially thought that I'm moving out from dark dungeons of coal mines to the bright lights of school education. Much to my horror, I discovered that it is not so, because whereas in coal, mining was underground, mafias were above it. In education, all the mafias are underground, eating into the essentials of Indian society. It is just crazy. So in order to understand and find some solutions, I traveled through the country. I traveled to 24 states in the first 3 months. And when I say states, it was not merely state headquarters. I used to go to Bastar, Sukma, traveled from Pune to Goa by car, dropping down on the way, traveled from Srinagar to Leh, not taking the national highway, going deep inside mountains to understand education. And it is during these visits that I discovered wonderful work being done in the context of public-private partnership. And one such example which you mentioned was in Pastepada. This is a village 120 kilometers north of Thane district, district headquarters. It's in tribal area. It's a government primary school with no electricity. So I visited that school and the school teacher took me inside the class. Sandeep Gund, I remember his name. And what I saw was shocking. I saw that every child had a tablet. So I asked him, "Yaar, bijli kahan se lata?" I'm told there is no electricity here. So he took me around the school, showed me the foldable solar panel through which he was charging the batteries, and batteries he was charging the tablets. Then the next question was, where did you get the money to buy these tablets? Because government doesn't give you so much money. So he narrated his story. He said that when he came to the school, there were about 40, 50 children in the school, and quite a few of them didn't come. They were all shapes and sizes. He didn't know what to do, but he had a second-hand laptop. So he used to download, educational videos from where he lived. He had the internet. He used to bring to the school and play those videos. So the children used to congregate around him. They used to learn something. After 2 months, about 20 parents came to the school asking him a very funny question. Master ji, pehle to school jaate nahi thi, ab bhagte hain school ke liye. Aapne kya kar diya? So he explained to them isne kya kiya. And then when he found the parents interested, he requested them to contribute 500 rupees each. Now these were poor people, but they still contributed. So Sandeep Gund bought 2 tablets, attached them to the laptop. And this passion of the teacher was traveling around. So one day a CSR funding agency and an NGO visited the school, and they were very impressed with the passion of the teacher. So they decided to fund the tablets and a smart screen. It was around that time that I visited the school, and I was also very impressed. So I took a photograph with Sandeep Gund and tweeted it. Suddenly he became a local hero. So other school teachers started visiting school like a pilgrimage, and they started replicating it. In between, I met the President of India, Mr. Kovind had just taken over as president. So I was meeting him in a different context altogether, but there was some time available. So I narrated this wonderful story to him, and he was also very impressed. So I could see it on his face that he was impressed. So I asked him whether he'd like to meet the teacher. He said, "Why not?" So I called the teacher over to Delhi. He met the President of India. A photograph was taken. It was tweeted, and suddenly Sandeep Gund becomes a national hero. But that's not the end of the story. The Pastepada model where this school exists has now been replicated in more than 50,000 schools of Maharashtra. That's the news. So that's the beauty of public-private partnership. Here are government schools funded by the private sector. 354 crores required for these schools all came from the private domain, none from the public. And there are many such examples. In fact, I collected 110 such examples, called them over to Delhi, spent 6 days with them, understood what they're doing, then picked up 24 such models, took them back to the states, they started replicating. I'm so glad post-retirement, I'm still associated with the scaling of this operation through a foundation that I set up called the Nexus of Good, where I'm trying to talk about the good work that is happening, and also to see how many people could be associated, to see how this goodness can grow, how we can learn from this good work, how we can appreciate it, how we can replicate it, how we can scale it.
All right, sir. So partnership between state and center is a very crucial fundamental ingredient for good governance. For instance, as we know in Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, so why treating states as allies is critically crucial for Indian polity, because if otherwise not done, it will lead to the failure of governance.
You know, we must understand very clearly that center is a fiction. Actual action is in the states. So the center cannot afford to boss over the state governments. Swachh Bharat Abhiyan succeeded because the secretary traveled like mad and he went to the states. Before that, in 2014, when there was a major coal crisis and we were short of coal, crisis to an extent that 25 power plants had coal reserves of only 1 or 2 days. It was as bad as that. I distinctly remember that the Chief Minister of Maharashtra rang me up at 12 o'clock during the day, and he asked me, there is a serious crisis of coal supplies. Can you come to Bombay? I said, you tell me when I should come. He said, aaj aa jaiye. So I said, it's already 12 o'clock. He said, no, the crisis is so serious that you have to come. So I took a 4 o'clock flight, reached Bombay at 6 o'clock. Meeting started at around 7:30. It ended around 1 o'clock in the night. In the 6 o'clock morning, I took a flight again because 10 o'clock there was a meeting with the Chief Prime Minister here. So that was the crisis. And as against that, we came to a situation in 2 years where we were prepared to export coal to Bangladesh. So this turnaround came on account of many reasons. But people ask me, what was the biggest reason if you point single? The single reason was that we took states on board. During the 2 years of my existence as coal secretary, I didn't convene a single meeting with the state governments in Delhi. For everything, I used to go to the field, talk to the chief minister, talk to the chief secretary, talk to the officers, find solutions, convey a value proposition, and that work. So taking states on board is extremely, extremely critical. There may be politics behind it. I remember even at that point in time, Mamata Banerjee was going hammer and tongs at the center, but she gave me land for coal blocks because the message to her was, you do your politics, but this is economics. You, the state will lose, the center will lose, everyone is a loser. So you have to convey a value proposition to the states for them to accept what you're saying. You can't write a roughshod and say, this is the order of the central government. No, you have to convince them that what you're saying is beneficial to them, and that works.
All right, sir. So what's the interrelation between governance and society in your point of view? For instance, before the Modi government came in, cleanliness drives like Swachh Bharat used to be there, but it wasn't regarded as much salient. But after the Modi government, how the government has impacted the mentality of the society, which resulted in taking up the cleanliness at par?
You know, the biggest factor in this was taking stakeholders on board. Meaning the biggest stakeholder were the state governments, the municipal corporations. They were taken on board. They were conveyed this message that is as much essential for you as for the central government. It may be a program of the central government, but its ultimate benefit will accrue to the people of the state, and you can take credit for that. That's the most critical part. In a large number of schemes that are run by the central government, this sort of a message doesn't go. There is so much to learn from Swachhata Abhiyan in terms of how it worked. Because most of the secretaries, they don't move out of their rooms. They're sitting here. They're holding meetings, passing orders, pushing. No, it doesn't work that way. We have to learn from what happened in Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. The secretary moved out, the team moved out. They worked as partners with the state governments, not as boss of the state governments. That's what that made the difference.
So you stated that we all inherently know what is good, yet we allow the den of devil to drown the good, which brought the nexus of good movement. So please share us your thoughts on this interrelation, which impacts your optimistic perspective and also the journey of this movement, of how you started from just a Twitter account and now it's a full-fledged movement spreading confidence, zeal, and positivity everywhere.
You know, I was, when I was secretary coal and then secretary school education, I was getting a bit disturbed at the negativity around in the society. Because, you know, nation wants to know only negative things. The world has either collapsed or is about to collapse. You know, everyone is talking negatively, criticizing, shouting at each other. Even now, I mean, I've stopped watching television, but once in a while when it gets opened and you watch a discussion on the television channel, you feel it's an entertainment channel, not a television channel. Because everyone is talking negatively. It created an impact or an environment where even people who were good felt that good cannot happen. Now that's a very bad way of looking at things, because it creates negativity, because all the rascals and ruffians were coming together and the good were fighting the battles all alone. So in that context, I felt, and then when I went around the country and saw this wonderful work being done, I realized if we can talk about good, then probably goodness could grow. And the example that I gave to you of Pastepada, of Sandeep Gund, actually germinated that idea that if I can notice good, if I can understand good, if I can appreciate good, then probably I'll be able to propagate good. And that Pastepada thing clearly demonstrated that good can be understood, they can be appreciated, and results are positively devastating in the sense that it can grow to 50,000 schools. And it has happened in a number of other ways. Hence, I set up this Nexus of Good, starting, as you rightly said, with a small Twitter handle in terms of merely narrating good, positive stories. The idea was to demonstrate to everyone that good can happen because good is happening. The tragedy is that most of us are so fond of masala that we don't want to listen to positive stories. We get a kick out of talking negatively about everyone else. So I was trying to create a parallel narrative, whether I can get a kick out of appreciating somebody. And that's a passion with most of us who join the Nexus of Good. And I request all of you to join the Nexus of Good, because goodness needs to be encouraged. People need to believe that good can happen because it is happening. It is necessary for the good people to come together. And that is what it was, starting with the Twitter handle. Then we set up this portal. Now it's a very vibrant portal. We have this regular webinars where positive stories are being shared. We have city chapters who are organizing their own webinars. We have a quarterly newsletter which comes out narrating these stories. I write a weekly column in a newspaper talking about one's Nexus of Good story. So it's now picking up gradually. People are joining in. People have started believing that good can happen because good has happened and it will continue to happen, and good can grow. There are many such examples. If you go to the portal, you will find hundreds of stories where good work has happened and it is scaling. So the conviction that you have in yourself will grow, that good can happen, it can grow, and good people can come together.
So, sir, the Nexus of Good movement has its origin from you only because you have a very optimistic outlook. Just like when you asked your friend, how's the coal ministry? And he said, have you watched Gangs of Wasipur? But still, you had such an optimistic outlook that you turned over the coal ministry 360 degree.
You know, when I remember when I walked into the room of coal secretary, it was like walking into a graveyard, because CBI was after files, it was after officers. So initially I was a bit in a state of a shock, but soon I found my balance. And my response was that the situation is so bad that it can't become worse. So anything that will happen will be an improvement on what the situation is, and I can walk away with the credit. So that's the optimism. And that, that positive energy in the ministry was such after 4 or 5 months that we used to jokingly say, give us the Kashmir problem, we just might find a solution. That was the positive energy that prevailed in the room. I had a fantastic team, everyone very positive about finding solutions, and we could find some solutions, if not all.
Sir, in your point of view, how is time chief key for governance? For instance, there was a lockdown
Can you be
at a
slightly
time.
louder?
Sir, am I audible properly?
Yeah, you are audible, but slightly louder, yeah.
All right. Sir, I was asking that how is time a chief key for the governance? For instance, there was a lockdown at the time when the COVID-19 case statistic was quite less. But now when the case statistics is more and there's a requirement of the lockdown, we cannot have it. Because though the economy has already collapsed, so further lockdown will be a hindrance to a further growth. So, sir, what are your thoughts on how time impacts the governance of any particular city or any particular state or nation?
Time.
How does time impacts the governance?
What impacts the governance? Sorry?
Sir, I'm asking, how is time a chief key for governance? How does time impacts the governance? Yes,
no, I can't understand
time duration.
No, I can't understand your question. What is
Sir,
your question?
I'm saying like, so the question is that how is time a chief key for governance? For example, when we had COVID-19 case statistics in March and April, we had a lockdown at that time. And that time the case numbers were quite less. But now when there's a requirement of the lockdown and even the case numbers are quite high, we cannot have a lockdown because though the economy has already collapsed, a further lockdown will be a hindrance to a growth. So, sir, how is like time a chief key in governance?
Let us try and understand. COVID is a very unusual situation, very unusual. No one had predicted what will happen. No one knew what will happen. So we all can have a hindsight wisdom that government should have done this, government should have done that. I may have an opinion also. But at that point in time, they got and took a decision. I mean, we may be critical of some of the decision, but they had to take a decision. They took a decision. Now the situation is such. It's a very difficult choice to make. If you lock down totally, the economy will collapse, people will die in any case. If you don't lock down, there will be cases. Now, what government has done is, it has bought time with the initial lockdown and created facilities for tackling patients with COVID infection. I think that's the right way of going about it. Because had it opened earlier, and if the infection had grown at that point in time when COVID happened, then government did not have hospitals or places where people could be admitted. Now, given that time that government had, has been able to create those facilities where COVID infection could be handled. But if you look at the latest data, I think the number of recoveries are more than the number of people who are getting infection. But no one has control over infection. I mean, I don't think anyone can do that. Even Donald Trump now is infected with COVID. So there's no control. You can only handle the consequences of what happening. And it happens in life in general also. Sometimes you are hit by something over which you have no control. It has happened. The best is how best you can handle it. And I think government is doing a decent job.
Definitely, sir. So you have your own brand statement, that is, the coal sector mining was underground, but mafia was overground. But in education sector, all mafia is underground, eating into essentials of Indian system. So who are the mafias you're particularly spotting out that?
If you read my book, I have narrated all these mafias, starting with the first and the biggest mafia is the B.Ed and D.El.Ed colleges education mafia. I have written a full chapter on how we attempted to tackle that mafia. We failed because a senior officer had to quit IAS because of the mafia pressure and because of the high court pressure. He resigned from the service. So that's the biggest mafia. The other mafia is publication mafia. And for that, that mafia was after the chairman CBSE to get her out also. But in this case, I stuck to my guns and she was not shifted. She handled that. And the good news is she's presently Secretary School Education, Government of India. The third mafia is the private schools mafia. And when I say that, these mafias are not, all schools are not bad, all private schools. They're just a handful of them. By definition, mafia is not everybody. Mafia is a handful of people who are actually destroying the system. So there's the private school mafia. So there are many such mafia. There is the teacher recruiting mafia, the teacher transfers mafia. So there are many mafias that I've listed out in my book and explained to them. These mafias are backed by VIPs, important people. Unlike coal, where everyone knew who the culprit was and you could take action against them. In education, these are all well-entrenched people. It's very difficult to take action against them.
So what are your thoughts on the new education policy? As we have already been an HRD secretary, do you feel the new policy would be able to blossom on the ground level? Because as we know, the quality of the education can never be compromised. It's the base of the future.
The policy is very good. I think I accept a couple of points which I've been mentioning. I think it's very well drafted. Anything that could be done or should be done with education is listed there. Barring the lack of emphasis on engaging with private domain and private sector, the rest of it, I think policy is very good. Starting from early childhood education to mother tongue, teaching in mother tongue, to focus on teachers, to providing that flexibility, to the focus on holistic learning. It's a very well-defined policy. My only problem with the policy is that where is the money going to come from? The policy says that 6% of the GDP should be allocated to education sector. Now, this was said by Dr. Kothari long ago, but that 6% never came. And I don't see 6% coming again. So money is going to be a major problem. As I said on those 7 dimensions, one of the important dimensions is financial viability. And viability comes through availability of money. I don't see that money coming. I would be very happy if it does come. But policy as such is very good.
All right, sir. The feel and fragrance of the first book of any person is an out-of-world experience, and it's a very incredible experience which is complex to be described in words. So please share your experience of your first book.
First book?
Yes, sir.
First book was written over a period of time. It is much more random than the second book. Second book is much more organized. The first book came up because there was, when I moved around and spoke to people, there was a lot of negativity even in the civil service, a lot of cynicism in the civil service. So I wrote to demonstrate that you can be yourself and yet perform. You don't have to necessarily toe the line of somebody. And that's what the book was. I also wanted to demonstrate that how I enjoyed being in the civil service, how much I enjoyed. And I also wanted to convey my gratitude to those that helped me become what I had become. So if you look at the chapters, I've taken names of a number of people who were responsible for making me the officer that I ultimately became. But the second book was on a different reason, because I used to go to the academy and I used to see, and I've written in my preface that I used to see that youngsters, when I joined the service, were very enthusiastic. But as they went up in the seniority ladder, cynicism crept in. A lot of them became very cynical. And the idea of writing this book was to demonstrate to those officers that you can still do a lot. Because if you don't do it, and it depends on you and nobody else, you are the person responsible for everything. You can't get away by saying, उम्र भर यही भूल करता रहा, गाले धूल चेहरे पे थी, आईना मलता रहा. So you can't blame others for it. Yes, the job is difficult because the book opens with a couplet. It says, मुख्तसर सी जिंदगी के अजब से अफसाने हैं, या तीर भी चलाने हैं, परिंदे भी बचाने हैं. So that's the quintessential dilemma. So I've tried to define the dilemma that a civil servant faces through his career. But ultimately, my take is that despite these dilemmas, despite these handicaps, despite these problems, if a civil servant so desires, he can perform. And I also say he should perform. But the focus has to be on himself, not anybody else. And that's why the second book ends with another couplet. खुद ही को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी कदर क्या है. So that's what the second book is all about.
So the concept of efficiency in context of good governance also includes the use and preservation of natural resources and the protection of environment. But we see in India, neither the government nor the citizen focus on this aspect of efficiency in regards to the governance. So, sir, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I don't think there is lack of efficiency. They do attempt, but there are certain factors in which efficient delivery becomes difficult. And one of the biggest problems is the delays in the government. And the delays happen because the civil servants don't take decisions. They don't take decisions because they're afraid, because if they do take decisions, action could be taken against them. So I have also written a chapter called 5 C's in my book. The CBC, CVC, CIG, CIC, CAG, and the courts. So there are these inhibiting factors that prevent an officer from taking a decision. Earlier, there was a provision in the Prevention of Corruption Act, which created a lot of problems because you could haul up an officer even if he did not have a Malaf ID. Now, of course, it is corrected. So all these factors together prevented a civil servant from taking quick decisions, consequent to which there were delays, consequent to which there was lack of efficiency, and so on and so forth.
So since past quite long, you had stated that there are 6 qualities or attributes for any idea, policy or reform to be strengthened. That is, as you already said, politically acceptable, socially desirable, technologically feasible, financially viable, administratively doable, and judicially tenable. But recently, sir, you also added the 7th attribute, that is emotionally relatable. So please share your field of vision on the...
The last part, I think I explained to you when I was explaining that. Sometimes I might feel that this is good for you. But unless you accept it good for you, it won't happen. So I may feel that it is socially desirable for you, for people. But I have to convince them. And that's where Swachh Bharat Abhiyan convinced the beneficiary that what was being done was good to them. Now, I may think that it is good for the people, but until the people feel it is good for them. And you look at it, the Farms Bill, that's where it went wrong. Probably the government wasn't able to convey to the farmer that not only is socially desirable, it is good for them. And that's where your communication mechanism has to be such that you have to convince people that it is good to them. That's emotionally related.
Sir, recently in the last tenure of the Modi government, the government had a decision to recruit professionals from outside bureaucracy into IAS. So so do you think that is it a good reform? What is your take on the reforms required in civil services?
First of all, we have to clearly understand that as a person goes up the ladder, it is not his expertise that comes into play. What comes into play is his capability to manage men and women. It is not his expertise. The only expertise that he requires as he goes up the ladder is in terms of his ability to manage men and women. So I have no quarrel with getting people lateral entry. But what we have to do more importantly is to see that we get such people in service who are able to manage men and women. And I have written a full chapter in my book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, where I talk about how this can possibly be done, right from recruiting, leaders who have the potential to become leaders, people who have the potential to become leaders, then training them appropriately to become leaders, then mentoring them to become appropriately leader, then treating them to appropriately to become a leader. And that's how you'll get leaders. So what we require in government service are leaders. One thing is very clear. Expertise can be outsourced, but attitude cannot be outsourced. Attitude develops over a period of time, and that can be developed through appropriate training and mentoring.
All right, sir. So there's also this thing that no matter how qualified IAS person is, he always gets one punishment, that is transfer. So what is your take on this thing?
No, I don't think transfer is a punishment at all. It is our wrong assessment of transfers. For a civil servant, as I've written in the book, transfer is like death. It is inevitable. It's bound to happen. Why worry about it? And in any case, if you believe in Hindu philosophy, you will be born again. You're not chucked out of the service. You'll get some other assignment. Go and do the work there. No one should ever feel that it is only remaining in a position that you can do, because transfers are not in your hand. They're in somebody else's hand. And I've always believed, why hassle over issues over which you have no control? Somebody has that, let him transfer you. But if you're good enough, then I can assure you that you will not be transferred as often as you are. Some of us have this belief that I can wear it as a badge of honor that I've been transferred so many times. Because ultimately you have to deliver. Now, one must understand the difference between compromise and accommodation. It is when we treat everything as a compromise that we start fighting with everyone else. A number of occasions where you feel something what is right may not actually be right. So you have to accommodate somebody else, so long as it doesn't violate a law. Now, I have a particular point of view and I see that's the only point of view, then obviously you'll fight with everyone. Once you get over that feeling that I am the only right person in the world, which some of us has, you won't have this problem. You have to accommodate. You have to understand the limitations within a politician works. So if there is a discretion involved, you give your point of view, and if you are overruled, do it. But if he asks you to do anything illegal, you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do that. Take that transfer. Otherwise, when two people discuss whether it's politician or otherwise, there has to be accommodation between the two. Some of us feel that I am the only right person, I am the only honest person, the world is dishonest. And hence we end up fighting with everyone.
Yes, sir. So, sir, now we would like to wrap up the session with a few lines from the first page of your book, that is, समय रुका नहीं हम क्यों ठहर गए, समय रुका नहीं हम क्यों ठहर गए, अभी तो हम चले भी नहीं हैं फिर क्यों थक गए, उठो पथिक पथ भ्रमित हो, 2 मील अंधियारे में, श्रेष्ठ वही जो गिरा नहीं हो क्षणिक निराशा में, जागो जगाओ मन मत भलाओ, एक मसीहा तुम भी बन जाओ. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.